Bit of a fan moment. I found this when I saw you at Watermelon Park Fest.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Like 2007 or 2008 or something.
Uh-huh.
I was a teenager, and that was like one of my first records. So.
Oh,
anyway.
wonderful. Gosh, and that was funny that putting out Dona Got a Ramblin' Mind. I mean, it was an uphill battle because everybody thought I was crazy for putting out vinyl back then.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, there wasn't a lot of artists doing that.
Yeah, it was basically indies and punk bands, and then it was the Carolina Chocolate Drops. So I'm glad that you've got a copy of it because that was something that I took a lot of pride to try to get that one out there.
I still listen to it. Well, let me dive into all this stuff. We have Dom Flemons joining us. He is an honorary doctorate recipient, Grammy winner, 2-time Emmy nominee, International Acoustic Music Award Grand Prize winner, and prior U.S. Artist Fellow. He's a musician based in Chicago, famously known as the American Songster, since his repertoire covers over 100 years of American roots music. He expertly plays banjo, guitar, harmonica, jug, percussion, quills, fife, and rhythm bones. He's the co-founder of the Carolina Chocolate Drops and the founder of American Songster Productions. Thank you for joining us today for an interview.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Quentin. It's a real pleasure to be on the program. I love what you do, and so when you reached out, I'm so glad that you did.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I'm excited to dive into all things about your music, a lot of the historical aspects about the music that you preserve and just bring to so many audiences. So I want to kind of start, I guess, from the beginning of your experience. What got you into folk music?
Oh, well, I mean, it first started off with old rock and roll, actually. When I first started to think about playing music, I saw a documentary on the history of rock and roll. I guess I was about, 15, 16 years old. Up to that point, I had been playing in the school band. I played pit orchestra percussion, and then I played marching bass drum in the marching band as well. So that was always a big love of mine. Always loved singing as well. And so when I saw this documentary, it was broken down into different parts. So that's what got me into like Louis Jordan's music, as well as the music of Sun Records, Muddy Waters music. And then there was an episode on the folk revival. And that's what got me into Bob Dylan's music, Phil Oakes, Lightning Hopkins, Judy Collins. I think those were some of the people that were featured in the episode. And from there, I decided to start playing the guitar. So I got an old guitar at a little guitar shop over in Phoenix, Arizona, where I was born and raised. And that was my journey in starting. So I started busking on the streets, playing in coffee houses, and began building a repertoire.
That's great. And I think all musicians should busk. I think it's a great experience to kind of cut your teeth. I was in a folk band in high school, and we used to busk outside of the grocery store because we knew people had money if they're going to the grocery store.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the best way to take your music out of a formal performing space and to be able to appreciate when you get something out of your audience, which is usually money. But sometimes you might get great conversation out of the experience, but you get to feel the audience and you get to communicate with them directly. And sometimes when you're in a formal setting, people won't be quite as honest and direct, and you don't have the full experience with them. So I feel busking is essential for that. And that was something that I was drawn into. And so I was doing that, and then finding records. This is before the big vinyl boom where people were interested in vinyl records. So I was finding a lot of old records of different performers that over the previous 30, 40 years had been making records. And so I had my time of being able to sit and analyze them and come up with my own ideas of what to do and what not to do. And it wasn't just folk music. It was also early jazz music. I got into Jelly Roll Morton's music, Charles Mingus, early bebop. I love beat poets, and so I got a lot of their records like Allen Ginsberg and Lawrence Ferlinghetti and people like that. Country music, blues, and Yeah, I mean, it was always a mixture of everything.
When you were listening to these artists, I mean, you mentioned you had that analysis side of things. Did you find that you were also trying to play the music as you listened? Like, oh, I want to hear, like, I'm hearing what Muddy Waters is doing. I want to try to emulate that. I hear what Bob Dylan's doing. I try to want to emulate that. Or is it more of just you're kind of taking it all in?
Well, there was a combination of both. There was taking it in. There was some music that I loved listening to it, but I could tell that I didn't want to try to play it or replicate it necessarily. And when it came to certain blues artists, for example, there were people like Reverend Gary Davis. I love Reverend Gary Davis, but I never tried to play like Reverend Gary because I found that his music was so complex in a way that to do an imitation of Reverend Gary would even fall short because even at the pinnacle, I couldn't ever make it to Reverend Gary Davis. You know, Robert Johnson's another artist I felt the same way about. Skip James, you know. Even if you do it perfect, it's still not them. So because they were so singular. So I found myself drawn to some of the people that were more on the fringes of blues music, like Papa Charlie Jackson, Henry Ragtime Texas Thomas, and even like people like Leadbelly. You know, a lot of these early songsters, their material lent itself to being reinterpreted. And so I found that I was drawn to that type of music. And it sort of was a place where all of the genres sort of blended together. And I didn't have words for it at that particular point. But that was the type of music I was into. And then, of course, I was into 60s and 70s stuff. I learned Bob Dylan and learned Tom Waits music, Jim Croce, Cat Stevens, Leonard Cohen, Joni Mitchell. I learned all that type of stuff as well. So it was a full process of taking in the music and then being able to go backward in time over several years of performing.
That's amazing, and I think that's so important, and it shows. I love that following like the through line. Like if you listen, like you brought up Leadbelly, and I remember in high school someone pointing out that Nirvana was doing a Leadbelly song, or Oh Black Betty was a Leadbelly song, and you can just kind of trace it back. So that's just phenomenal. I hope you're enjoying the interview. I want to pause real quick to talk about This Is Jazz and our books and courses. If you're a self-taught musician or a music teacher of any instrument, you're going to love my book, How to Teach Jazz and Improvisation. It's written in a way that's easy to understand, even if you don't have a jazz background. It gives you songs to play, ways to develop improvisation without fear of playing a wrong note, and lots more. It's available in print and ebook. And also, we have courses. So if you're a fan of jazz history, if you're a fan of jazz theory, you can find this and more at thisisjazz.com. All right, back to the interview. When you were finding these different artists and emulating them or writing your own music, is this also around the time you began to pick up other instruments? Because as I mentioned in your bio, you do play banjo and jug and harmonica and all of this, or did those instruments come later?
Well, they sort of came a little bit later. So as I mentioned before, I played percussion in school, and that was like my formal training. So the idea of having multiple instruments in my song bag was something that was always a part of my repertoire of music. And because you're always dealing with a lot of instruments, you're playing the triangle, the bass drum, the snare drum, the glockenspiel, and all those things in the orchestra pit. So the idea of having multiple instruments wasn't a foreign idea to me. But when I started to play folk music, it started out on guitar and harmonica. So I learned how to play those first. Later, I found a banjo. It's actually started out, a friend of mine had given me a banjo that was a 5-string without the 5th string in it. And since he was a guitar player, he didn't like the 5th string, the drone string. So he actually tuned it like a guitar and played it with the top 4 strings. And so then I tuned it to open G and started playing that in that particular style. First playing guitar numbers, and you know, that was how I started. But then as I went along, my ventures into jazz on record. First, it was like bebop, like like Mingus, Charlie Parker, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Cannonball Adderley, a lot of different folks like that.
Yeah.
But I then found the albums of like Sweet Emma Barrett and the Preservation Hall Jazz Band. And then I found from there was a whole subset of the New Orleans Jazz Revival. And that was something that, even to this day, I don't think people realize how many recordings they made during that period, because I'm constantly finding recordings from the George H. Buck collection, Storyville Records, Riverside Records, a lot of these labels that put out, it must have been 1,000 records of Percy Humphrey and Willie Humphrey and Emmanuel Sales and all these people. So I found myself drawn into traditional jazz. So as a 4-string player, I then found that there was this other history of 4-string banjo playing. So I was drawn to that. I also found myself drawn to the recordings of, there's Blind Blake, the 1920s ragtime guitarist, but in the 1950s there was a fellow named Alphonso Higgs who also called himself Blind Blake, and he was a Bahamian banjo player. So I found myself interested in Caribbean banjo playing as well. So I was drawing upon all of these different traditions. Then, of course, jug band music was a big part of my repertoire. I had heard the Jim Question Jug Band, and that led me to the Memphis Jug Band, Cannon's Jug Stompers, Louisville Jug Band. And so all of these things fed into the way that I was learning the banjo. So it wasn't one style. And I never really, because I had 4 strings, and again, I was out in Arizona, so I didn't really have like a formal banjo teacher. I didn't really understand how to do Scruggs-style banjo. I understood clawhammer banjo by sound, but I didn't understand how to do it. So I figured out a way to replicate the sound. As I mentioned before, as I was a drummer, a banjo in essence is a drum that you can play chords on. And so I always viewed the banjo in that manner. So I used drum rudiments to play my banjo style. And that's why it's very different than a lot of people, because I always viewed it as a drum more so than a melody instrument. But then over time, I picked up more melodic aspects of playing. So that was a big part of my banjo journey was sort of reaching into these different facets of the playing. And then, of course, it led to the Black Banjo Gathering, and that's when I began to see and hear that there was a definitive reason why black banjo playing was important and historically relevant. But I had heard a lot of black banjo music in Arizona.
That's amazing. And I love that idea of kind of listening to it and trying to figure it out yourself. And I think there's so much merit and creativity to figuring out yourself. I was thinking about Duke Ellington, how he was pretty much self-taught, like in a lot of the chords and the harmony and the things that he would do might break traditional counterpoint rules or harmony rules, but he came up with all these amazing things specifically because he didn't know those traditional rules. So it enabled him to be more creative. And I imagine if you had been just practicing your Scruggs style, you might not have come up with that. So I think that's absolutely fascinating. And you're right. I mean, banjo does have such an important part in jazz too. I think a lot of people are surprised to know that banjo was the primary string instrument for jazz for decades. Duke Ellington, Jelly Roll Morton, all having banjo players in their groups. So that is amazing. You mentioned jug music, and just in case people aren't familiar, what makes jug music, and how? I mean, we know, but for those that don't, what is a jug band?
Well, basically, a jug band. So first, let's talk about the jug. So literally, you're taking, in the most ideal situation, a stonemason jug. So like one of those big moonshine whiskey jugs like they make in Kentucky, and you're blowing into it, and you're buzzing your lips in a similar manner to a kazoo. But it's almost like a bad embouchure on a horn, and you are creating tones and sounds with that bad embouchure, and the jug itself is a resonator for those sounds. So so making that sound and putting it into a resonating chamber, you can mimic the sound of a trumpet, a trombone, a tuba, or a drum. In essence, you can do other sounds, but those are the main sounds that you generally do in a jug band. And traditionally, in a lot of the black jug bands, they were built around maybe a one songster, like a person playing guitar or banjo, like the Cannon's Jug Stompers was around a banjo player, Gus Cannon. The Memphis Jug Band was around a guitar player, Will Shade. And then they would have other peripheral instruments, such as the kazoo. They might have a fiddle. They may have a mandolin. And those other instruments sort of fill out the band. And based on the region, in the traditional jug bands, you would have different styles. So the Memphis-based groups tended to be like a blues band, like a very stripped-down blues band. While the bands that were up the river in Louisville, Kentucky, they tended to be more jazz-based bands. And so they have saxophone and violin and, a very different set of instrumentation. And even the Louisville jug bands also used multiple jug players. So you even have jug players playing in harmony with each other, too. So it's that's the idea around jug band music. And so I had seen, because jug band music over the years then was sort of translated into sort of a novelty instrument. So like if you ever watched old episodes of Andy Griffith's show, the Dillards, who were a bluegrass group that played on there, they had a jug band version of that group where they would play. So you could think of the sort of the mountaineer performer where they're singing a song like the Good Old Mountain Dew, and then granddad's in the back blowing on a jug. And so that's kind of the stereotypical version of what the jug was when I started thinking about playing it. Because then of course, in the 1960s, a group like the Jim Kweskin Jug Band, who were sort of the template for a lot of the San Francisco bands that would come in the later 60s, when I first heard them and heard their jug player Fritz Richmond, I thought to myself, I could do that. I could play the jug. And so I decided to put it to the test. I grabbed first it was a big Martinelli's bottle and tried to figure out, can I blow into it and make a sound out of it? First I blew it over the top, and I was able to get a tone, but then I found that wasn't the way that they were making the sound. And then I tipped it over, and then I figured that you could then blow into it, and then I found you could make a tone. And locally in Phoenix, there was a folk festival that was near my house growing up, and I would attend that festival from 16 to 23 basically, and I was a part of that community, and I started bringing my jug down to the jams. And so I learned how to back people up. And that's one of the big things that I walked away with leaving Arizona, is I learned how to be a lead performer, but I also learned how to be a backup performer, which would, of course, be a big factor in creating the Carolina Chocolate Drops, because I knew how to then craft a sound that would be unique for other musicians when they were performing or playing. And the jug was part of that, the banjo was part of that, and then later, once I was in North Carolina and got the rhythm bones, that was a part of that as well.
I think so many perhaps non-musicians don't realize the skill that's needed to be a good accompanist.
Yes, and especially when you have someone that's just singing. Like, when I was working with Rhiannon Giddens, she could tell you if the chord changes were right or wrong, but she couldn't tell you what the chord changes were. And so that was where I was at many times with the Chocolate Drops, is I was the sole guitar player in the group. And so I had to figure out the chord changes to back up the fiddle tunes, and had to figure out the chord changes to structure a song, because the other two members, they didn't really have that sort of knowledge. And so for me, I was then able to take the chord changes and then create a structure for a lot of the pieces. Or like when you hear Hit 'em Up Style, Rhiannon had a fiddle part for it, and she was singing it, and I found it was in G minor, so I created this riff around G minor and D minor that became a definitive part of the song itself.
Wow. That's fantastic. You mentioned there. Well, there's so many ways I could go because this is so fascinating. Um, I love to when I listen, whether it's the Memphis Jug Band or others. It does have both that role as accompanist. I think their control of pitch is amazing. When you hear just the walking bass lines, and sometimes you'll hear chromaticism. That's so impressive. And I remember too when we were in high school in that bluegrass band, we got an old stoneware jug, and we too thought you just had to blow over it like a bottle, and soon found out that was not the case. I wanna start talking about some of the parallels with jazz, and we've already mentioned a few of them. I think early jazz and other types of black roots music have a lot of those similarities in instrumentation. We've mentioned banjo, guitar, voice. I think some of the roots music might have more kind of homemade instruments, but I have heard some jazz recordings where they do have kazoo or a comb. I have a Jelly Roll recording where someone in his band is doing a trumpet solo with their mouth, which I just love. Just the tenacity to go for it. I don't think you might hear that as much anymore. But and then of course another element would be improvisation. That's heavy in jazz. Do you find improvisation featured heavily in some of the roots music that you've learned or studied?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that because there are a couple of different things to unpack. Of course, when it comes to jug bands, if you spend time looking just at the map of the United States and focusing on the Mississippi River, it literally goes from New Orleans, and then it eventually makes its way in parts out toward Chicago, but then it parts out toward eventually Davenport, Iowa. And all along the way, you have bands that were playing on the river boats and were also localized bands in each of these areas, and their style of playing just varies ever so slightly. In jazz history, they usually call them spasm bands, which are just really fast ragtime bands that are improvising a lot, and they make a lot of sound and noise in one way, but they're exuberant bands that are meant to play outside. They're busking bands. And one of the recordings that really set the trend for homemade instruments was a record called Arkansas Blues by a group from I guess they were from St. Louis now, if I think about it. They were called the Mound City Blue Blowers. And they featured a fellow who would become more famous in his jazz career, Red McKenzie. He was playing the fine-tooth comb with wax paper over it. And so if you imagine, if you put wax paper over a fine-tooth comb and then blow into the comb tooth side, so you're not putting the paper on you, you're putting the comb in front of you, you can do a kazoo, and you can get a full trumpet-like sound out of that. And that set a trend for homemade instruments. I guess they did that around 1924. And over the next years, going all the way into about, I'd say, right after the stock market crash, going into the Great Depression, you had a lot of jug bands and homemade instrument groups start to emerge. And so that's one piece of it there. When it comes to jazz, it's interesting because there's a period of time where jazz is all written music, and improvisation was something that was handled only as a selective piece of an orchestration. So when you're hearing someone like Fletcher Henderson, these guys are playing off the page. This is the reason that Louis Armstrong couldn't stay in Fletcher Henderson's band, because he could play off the page, he could read, but he didn't like to just stay right on the page. And so when he eventually broke away from Fletcher Henderson, this is also after he played with King Oliver, and King Oliver's band really was a page group that did some improvisation on the breaks. So the big innovation was playing hot, and then when the break happened, you could have that da 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 ba 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 da da da. It's almost it's almost the scratching of the turntable in its own type of way in modern 21st century terms. It's like waka, 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 boom, bah, drop the beat, and it was the equivalent to that for its time and place. So by the time you have the Louis Armstrong Hot 5 sessions happening, they're giving Louis all of the room to improvise as he pleases. Right. And so once you have that entering into the recorded market of records, that's when people start to copy his solos so that they can then improvise and then elaborate upon it, which is a big piece of what made jazz the phenomenon it became, because it was no longer a fully written music, but it was a type of music that then you could freely improvise. So then, go decades forward, bebop is like, hey, let's do I've Got Rhythm, and then let's do the changes, and then just improvise freely over it, and not even, we may establish the melody, but we don't have to. And that's kind of, in roots music, you have sort of a balance of the period that precedes that innovation, if that makes sense. Like old-timey music, for example, doesn't have improvisation along those lines. Fiddle and banjo music, you are playing the melody, and part of the impetus is to be able to just play that consistently. And you may have subtle improvisations, or a fiddle may do an extra double stop that is a variation on the melody, but they are not doing any sort of breaking away improvisation. That's why bluegrass was such an innovation for its time, because it incorporated that aspect of jazz into string band music. So then all of a sudden, a guy like Earl Scruggs comes in, or Bill Monroe, and then they're hitting a break and they're going into a full jazz type solo with string instruments, which was something people weren't accustomed to, because old time music just generally didn't do that. Blues has improvisation within it, but many times there's a very structured form that it is using, because it's a vocal music, and so generally the vocal is the emphasis for old time blues. And then there might be a nice solo section, or the solo is the whole structure. Like when you hear Charlie Patton, the whole structure is the improvisation. It's not just, he's not doing a solo like they would do in the 30s, like a Muddy Waters is, he sings and then he's doing a solo. And that's why Muddy Waters became such a popular performer, or Sonny Boy Williamson, where you're having a specific solo section. But in the early days, everything was the improvisation in essence, because that was written into the form of how they were performing the music. So anyway, that's kind of how a lot of the music was structured.
You touched on so many things. I want to kind of go to each one for a little bit. I love that you brought up early jazz, and how so much of it was written, because I think there is kind of a convenient way to tell the jazz story, which is jazz started in New Orleans and this guy named Buddy Bolden was improvising like crazy, and then everybody started improvising. But there's so much more nuance to it. I mean, the brass bands and the society bands, you're right, they were playing what was on the page, and they might embellish a little bit, or you get the ragtime musicians, like if you go as far back as Joplin, he didn't want to do anything with jazz. He thought of his music completely differently. And then you get some early people like U.B. Blake and Lucky Roberts, who are still playing rag, but they're swinging a little bit and they're improvising a little bit, but it's still not full on, here's 32 bars of brand new music.
Yeah.
Even if it's over the chord progression. So that's really... I like how that also traces into the other kind of roots music that you mentioned. When I listen to the Memphis Jug Band, they have sometimes that formula that you mentioned, where it's like singing, instrumental, break or solo, or singing back and forth. Were those instrumental breaks more or less worked out, or were those kind of taking a page out of Louis Armstrong's book and they're spending full 12 measures to make up whatever melody they want.
Yeah, I think that there's a combination. Sometimes, and the Memphis Jug Band is an excellent example because their group was never a stable personnel. So from session to session, you'll find the group sounds vastly different through its years of recording, which is wonderful as well because it allows you to sort of see the evolution of a group that's more or less based around one guy, Will Shade, and they have different tunes. Some of the tunes have a lot of improvisation. Other tunes don't. You know, some of them are just straight blues numbers, and the kazoo is doing improvisation around it. And again, the improvisation is in a similar style to a lot of the jazz of that time because you have sort of this polyphonic voicing that's happening. You know, so there was like with a lot of blues, the blues singer is a constant, and then you have a horn or a reed instrument or a kazoo that is weaving around the vocal, and then it is doing a call and response afterward. And it's like, you have to imagine like the Memphis Jug Band, I hate to say the poor man's version of it, but they're doing a rule-based version of the same type of call and response style. But then there are other ones where you can tell their singer Charlie Burse, who was part of it later, he's taking on aspects of like Cab Calloway's singing, and you can hear some of the later recordings where, you know, he's kind of I don't know. He has a funny thing he did because I love that you mentioned Eubie Blake and things like that, because one of the things that a lot of the ragtime based performers did is they had really complex forms that they could play slower, faster, or in any key. And the big embellishment was them actually hyping themselves up, because then they'd start playing and they'd say, "You see how good that is? Look at how good that playing is," you know. And there's
like Willie the Lion Smith.
Yeah, like, Willie the Lion is the same way, because he'll be playing a song and he'll say like, "Well, let me double it up just like this," and then he'll do some fancy lick to kind of show you how much he's mastered the music he's playing, and that was its own type of improvisation, which was its own hype man. Like I think of a lot of these piano players in their same type of way as you'd think of someone like a Jay Dilla. You know, they were like their own traveling producer. So you would just know that the piano player was like, okay, he has the stuff, whatever the stuff is. You know, if you get a piano in your bar and this guy sits down at it, now you're going to get the new hits of the day. And they sold those hits into publishing. But so with the Memphis Jug Band, you have a guy like Charlie Burse. He was known as Laughin' Charlie Burse. And so he has this sort of, this sort of thing that he does where it's like his signature laugh, you know. Yeah. All right, Mama, I'm going to talk a little bit about you. You know, and it was a signature style that he had, so that when you heard him on record, you'd know, oh yeah, that's Charlie Burse, and that's the Memphis Jug Band. And so each of the performers had that, you know, like Charlie Patton, he says, "Oh, sure." He says that on everything, you know, or, you know, he has call and response bits that are within his own, you know, his own songs, or, and each of the 1920s performers, they built their style around that. So like you hear the Memphis Jug Band, or not Memphis Jug Band, I mean the Mississippi Sheiks, for example, the guitar and fiddle group. There's a certain fiddle lick, which you'll hear on every one of their records. And that was a big part of a lot of these old time performers. If they weren't playing music written on the page, they were asserting a certain set of lyrics or motifs that would really set them apart from other people. So it's very interesting, you know, because even the written music, that's why they liked, all the band leaders really wanted to work with New Orleans musicians after a certain point. Not so much that they needed them to improvise, but they liked the way that they approached the notes. So they liked the tone and the timbre and the way they held notes. and that became part of what innovated jazz. Was, nowadays we just assume, oh yeah, when Louis hitting that one note, do, and he holds that excessively long note, that's something that everybody was doing, but they weren't. At that, to hold a whole, I don't know, 32 bars on a single note while the band is vamping under you. That was a huge innovation for that time, and people were copying the records too. They're hearing the records and they're saying, "How can I steal that?" And so it's such a vibrant community, and it wasn't just blacks. It was whites and blacks doing it. It was actually everybody, And even if we just go out of a black and white story, when Hawaiian musicians became very popular, people were copying the licks of the Hawaiian musicians when they became popular too, because it was just new sounds. People wanted to hear new sounds out of their Victrolas and tried to mimic them or bring them into their music somehow.
Yeah, I mean, that's so true. I mean, Duke Ellington would write, where he would label on his band's parts their names, not Alto 1, but it would be Johnny Hodges or Rabbit, his nickname. And then, Bubber Miley had the classic growling trumpet sound. When you mentioned the specific musicians that had their kind of coined phrase, it immediately made me think of Thelonious Monk, and I was wondering if this was intentional, like he knew and he was putting this in, or if it was just history repeating itself. But Monk almost always throws a whole tone scale into his solos. It doesn't matter what it is, you're always going to hear that kind of riff. So I think that's absolutely fascinating that we can hear that throughout all these genres. I had one more question, or I'm sure we might go into more stuff. This is such a cool conversation. You mentioned old-time music and how old-time music has always been a mystery for me, or I've been confounded by it, because you're right, it's not improvised, it's locked in. But when I got a fiddle I went to the Galax Fiddlers Convention, and they had a diner that had like a fiddle in the window, and I was like, I need that fiddle. So I tried to learn, and I wanted to learn old-time songs, and I had such a hard time finding like an authoritative version. Like if I wanted to learn John Brown's Dream, and I listened, and there's 12 versions of John Brown's Dream. Whereas in jazz, if you want to learn anthropology, go listen to Charlie Parker play anthropology, and there you go. So how does that work with old time? Is it kind of, are the songs passed down musician to musician? Is it geographic? Like on this side of the Appalachians, you're going to hear John Brown's Dream this way. On this side, it's that way. Can you tease that out?
It's a little bit of both. I will say that there are regional styles based on certain tunes, and that's a definitive. But that's something that's actually became more apparent to people once you had folklorists going down and collecting multiple fiddlers' recordings from regions. And so there are regional styles. And part of the reason for that particular distinction is that it is passed down. You can learn from a recording, but the best way to learn old-time music, and it's always been that way, is it's learned until perfect. And that's one of the ways that it's sort of passed down. It's very much an osmosis-style learning process where you may have people that will teach you specifically how to do it, but most of the time you have to just jump into the fray and be in the mix and keep on playing. Fiddlers, it's a little different for fiddlers. Fiddlers have to sit down, learn the melodies, and they have to know that because a fiddler is such a crucial part of old time music that they are literally the thing that's holding the tune together. When it comes to other accompaniment, because I don't play fiddle myself, I've always backed up a fiddler. A fiddler usually sets a structure in place, and then the other instruments have to figure out what they're going to do. And you can play every different way from, extremely fancy. You can do jazz chording behind old time fiddling. It doesn't always sound correct in terms of aesthetically what you want for old time music, but that has been done before. So dropping relative minor chords and changing out majors and things like that, you'll really upset people in an old time jam with that, because they'll be like, "What are you doing? This isn't jazz. It's old time." Generally you want to stay within the 3-chord or 2-chord or sometimes 1-chord, melodic structure of an old time number, especially as a guitar player. If it's a 1-chord song, usually you are playing a series of bass notes, so you're somewhere between a standard guitar player but also a tuba. You're somewhere. I like to think of it like when you hear Tejano bands, you tend to be in this sort of position of fluctuating, oscillating bass notes. Sometimes you have straight melodic lines that double with the fiddle. But that's all based on what type of old-time band you're going to be or what old-time group. Other times you're just banging on the guitar and the fiddle does the melody, and that's okay too. And that's that's one of the ways that old-time music can vary so much. And this is also the reason why young kids can learn old-time music too. So now if you have a song that has no chord changes and you're a fiddler, you can fiddle the melody, and this young child can just play 1 chord the whole time, and they're actually playing correctly. And it may not be fancy, but it is correct in of itself. And so it's a teaching tool to be able to bring people in. So that's what you find with a lot of old time music, is that it's perfected along the way. It's played until correct is how I define it, because it's not really a straight teacher-student situation in the traditional sense. And so that's kind of what I've seen. Banjo players, the same thing. Are you doing 3-finger? Are you claw hammering? Are you going to be a melodic banjo player, or are you doing polyphonic counterpoint? Because while the fiddle can be playing a melody that's in the upper register, you can play banjo in the lower register.
Yeah.
Or you can be in the 3rd position on the banjo, or you stay in the 1st position on the banjo. Do you have a bassist in the group? Is the bassist just oompahing with the 1/5?
Yeah.
Or are they doing walking bass, which is one of the big things bluegrass ended up taking in, is like you'll hear hard walking 4 on the floor, and that's one of the things that makes bluegrass bassing different than old time bassing. So you have a couple of different ways that you can approach the music in of itself, where the simplicity of old time music can be deceiving at times, because once you really sit down and try to learn it, then that's when you start to realize that there are subtleties to the music that are very difficult. And as I mentioned previously, you can then vary it. So then you have your backing up part, like for example, like with the Chocolate Drops, like a song like let me think, like Georgia Buck, for example. That type of song didn't have jug in it, and so I brought jug into it. So when I'm playing, I'm doing like sort of I'm hitting the tonic, and then in the second half of the tune, because a lot of old time tunes are broken into 2 parts: the A part, which is sort of a lower strain, and then the B part goes into a higher strain of notes, and it usually goes either A A B B or A B A B, or it just does. Certain ones are A until the fiddler feels like going to B, and then goes back to A a bunch. And so Georgia Buck is like a A until you feel like it, then you go to the B. I found with the B section, I could then do a walking. So Georgia Buck is dead, had last word he said, don't put no shortening in my bread. So I do da 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 da. B part did da 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 da. And that was the type of stuff that I heard on like Charles Mingus's Blues and Roots and those types of albums, and thinking about how Mingus restructured folk forms. And so I applied that to the Chocolate Drop. So that was something that wasn't a part of traditional music in that particular North Carolina Piedmont tradition, but me bringing the jug into it gave it its own specific flavor without changing the rhythm of the original music itself. Or when I was playing the guitar, there's a song we did on the Genuine Negro Jig album called Sandy Boys, and I did sort of, on the high part, I came up with this sort of half walking bass guitar line that, again, doesn't break up what the fiddle and the banjo are doing, but it creates a really interesting texture when it all comes together. And so those are the sort of things that you can do as an accompanist, especially when you have a very stable top layer with the fiddle or the banjo or both.
That's fantastic. I love that fusion. And Charles Mingus, man, yeah, what a great example, because he blends and layers and can be sometimes very harmonically stable as well, kind of like old time music. Like you listen to like Wednesday night prayer meeting, and they're just like hanging out on that chord for who knows how long. So that's really cool. I have one more thing, and I know I got to let you go. Can you mentioned pedagogy a little bit, how old time music is just a great way to get students or other generations in. Is there anything that you would recommend for musicians or teachers that want to pursue old time music or dip their toe into roots music? Any suggestions?
Well, of course, I'd recommend, find some good old time music. Of course, there are things like the Harry Smith Anthology of American Folk Music. I would also recommend. There's so many great records, so it's really tough to just break it down in one way or another. I'd look up people like the New Lost City Ramblers with my dear old friend Mike, God bless his soul, Mike Seeger, and John Cohen and Tracy Schwartz and Tom Paley, all good friends of mine that have passed away now. Like they did a lot of work to open up the door for old-timey music in many ways, and their records all have references back to their source material. There's that. Of course, any of the work I've done with the Carolina Chocolate Drops is always worth noting because, as I mentioned before, there were some really great arrangements we put together for the old-time music. Jazz-adjacent type of music and my experimentations into it, I'd recommend my album Prospect Hill, the American Songster Omnibus. And I have a couple of songs like Till the Seas Run Dry, which I took sort of the idea of New Orleans jazz and put it into a string band form. And on the omnibus version, the expanded one, I have two versions. One that has clarinet and bass and drums and second guitar. And then there's another version which is led by me playing six-string banjo, and then I have harmonica and fiddle as the melody instruments. And so showing the sort of a cross-section of those different instruments playing really intensive improvisational jazz. And so those are a couple of things I've done.
Yeah, thanks for bringing them. I was going to ask about your music, and yeah, you have such an amazing breadth too, and I think you've earned your name so much because there's so much packed into it. Yeah, I think everyone who watches and listens to this should do a deep dive on your discography because it's amazing. Yeah, absolutely. As far as where people can find you, you're all over streaming platforms. Can you tell us anything else where we can find you? Or I think you have a radio program or a foundation. Can you just give us some more information about those projects?
Oh, sure thing. So theamericansongster.com, that's my website, and that's the easiest way to find me. And if anybody ever wants to reach out to me, theamericansongster@gmail.com, that's the email, and I answer it. So I'm always glad to chat with people and direct them down the road that they'd like to go down, because that's the thing. There's a million ways to go with all this music, so it's always great to just open the door for some people so that they can search it out themselves. I mean, that's one of the things I've always been driven by is that I have my one version I've done, but
Right.
Everybody has their own way that they can go down this rabbit hole of all the different genres. So there's that. You mentioned the radio show, the American Songster Radio, which is on WSM on Nashville, Tennessee, home of the Grand Ole Opry. We're now in our 6th season on WSM, and that's been beautiful to do that. And we've had a lot of great guests. We had Steve Martin on there talking about banjo, Sam Bush. I had Branford Marcellus talking about Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, in which I participated on the soundtrack. And then we've also had Bobby Rush, king of the Chitlin Circuit, Mickey Guyton, the wonderful country singer, Miko Marks as well. So we've had quite a variety over there, and then you mentioned the foundation. I've been on the board of Music Maker Foundation for several years, since 2009, and they celebrated their 30th anniversary last year. And Music Maker is a nonprofit that helps out traditional Southern music makers. A lot of them are blues performers. I worked with a lot of their artists for many years when I was still living in North Carolina, particularly John D. Holman, Aljamain Hinton, and Boo Hanks. And I even did an album with Boo Hanks at one point, so you get to hear me performing with an elder blues singer, and I'm playing harmonica behind him, so that's something that was very special. They've all three have passed away since, but Music Maker helps out with, they say it's not a handout, it's a hand up. And that's one of the things that we try to do, so that these community musicians can keep making the music that helps strengthen their community just through the local power of music. And so that's all those main things. And but I have a little bit of all that on the website, theamericansongster.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for doing this interview. It was really cool to dive into all this stuff. So thank you, Dom.
Well, I appreciate Quentin. Like I said, I really have enjoyed seeing your work, and I'm so glad that you called me. So I really appreciate it.